I guess you could just hold him.
She'll have the lavalier. If you'd like to hand her that, you can hand her that.
So
whatever you want to do is fine.
So she can just stand at the podium.
Once I get her up and running, she can move about, whatever she'd like
Perfect,
to do.
perfect, perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem.
I'll just
let you on. Is there something you'd like me to do?
Just push people down front as fast as we possibly can. Okay. Anybody in the back, I just want to fill that front area, so that latecomers can sit in the back.
People that are standing?
Yeah.
Go for it.
I guess we'll probably be fine. Okay, great. I'm sure we'll be fine. That would be great.
And
What is your staff member's name who's walking in?
Lauren. Well, I'm sending out a staff bank, I swear. I'm so
I wish you
I'm
could.
the worst. I will remember that.
So the kids are taking that whole bit?
The kids are?
There are more. There's 7 more.
Great.
And then those ones.
Do you guys, Lois? Sit here. I got it. It's fine. That's great.
Like a couple months.
It's great. Don't worry
I'm
about
so
it.
sorry, guys.
Jeez. That's
Like
great.
I pay you in installments.
We'll talk parties too. Lois? No. Let me. I'm gonna.
So I'm going these ones?
Jamie.
These 3?
That's okay, right? And then these 7. Yeah, this is fine. Yeah. Chris?
And this one, next to me in the purple sweater. That one. Anywhere in there.
Does that mean I bring it each time? I'm going to try and fill it if I can.
She has this crazy. It's all right. And without glasses, I can't see.
Hello? I think he'll take it. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just about to get started, but a quick reminder to please turn off your cell phones. It'll be just another couple of minutes. Also, we'll be having a book signing immediately following the event, and there are Orion magazines for free out in the lobby, so please pick up a copy with Terry's fabulous and devastatingly beautiful article. And we'll start in just a couple of minutes. There are a few more stragglers, so keep talking, and it'll be 2 minutes. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Lisa Consiglio. I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Writers Foundation, and on behalf of the board and staff of the AWF, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 14th annual Winter Word Series of author readings and talks. Tonight's event is co-presented by the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies and is sponsored by the City of Aspen, Les Dames d'Aspen, Aspen Square, Merrill Lynch, Orion Magazine, the Aspen Times, Aspen Sojourner, Aspen Public Radio, the Aspen Daily News, and KD&K. And I also want to give a very, very special shout out to Patrick Kelly and to Eric Hoffner. Thank you so much for helping to help make this happen. Someone once said that a world community can only exist with world communication. Tonight we honor a very special and highly influential world communicator as we celebrate a constellation of communities gathered here to acknowledge the power of her words. With us tonight is a community of writers, a community of concerned citizens, of artists, of activists, of environmentalists, of stewards, of friends and supporters of the Aspen Writers Foundation, our members, staff, and board, and our colleagues at the Aspen Institute. Our guest of honor will be interviewed by Daniel Shaw, a member of the AWF board, who is dedicated to his family, to conservation, to the literary arts, and to our community. As many of you know, Daniel's mother-in-law and the very wonderful Isa's mother, the late, great Jessica Cato, whose spirit is with us tonight, and I'm quite sure she would encourage us to think globally and act locally, to honor and protect our community, to put pen to paper, and to join forces whenever possible as we fight for the future and for change. And on that note, it is my pleasure to hand the podium over to Tom Cardamom. I shouldn't have looked at you. The Executive Director of our co-presenter, the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm reminded of a previous speaker from Utah that my wife Jody invited here in 1971 to speak at her high school graduation. He was a fire lookout on the north rim of the Grand Canyon and came reluctantly, and some parents actually left the high school graduation speech before it was over. It sort of separated, I think, the group that's here tonight from other-minded folks at that evening, and of course that was Edward Abbey. And speaking of locally, I can't help but mention that there was a wonderful juxtaposition of articles in today's paper, one which spoke of Terry Tempest Williams, and one of the key words or phrases was sacred rage, and the other which mentioned a public hearing that I was at with several concerned citizens last night, and the watchword there may have been holy hell, I would say, which is what was directed at the developer. And one of the gentlemen who spoke quite eloquently and firmly, who knew nothing about ACEs but had read it, a piece in the paper just before the meeting, came up to me afterwards and he said, what is ACEs? And in a nutshell, I told him that we are an organization dedicated to building a community of educated and motivated and equipped land stewards. And so if any of you are new to ACEs, that is what we are. And Al Deach was there as well, a former board president. He spoke. He channeled Elizabeth Pepke quite nicely. Her fierce female protectress self, shovel over shoulder. And Nitza, Elizabeth's niece, also channeled Elizabeth in her persuasive feminine side. And I did my best to channel the Lorax, speaking for the trees. And before I speak at a public hearing like I did last night, I go back to the voices that help me, that inspire me, and ground me. Among them are folks like Wallace Stegner, Barbara Kingsolver, Wendell Berry, and Terry Tempest Williams. And thank you for being there with me last night. And also the spirit of Jessica Cato. We're so honored that she was sitting next to me, giving me some strength, and that was great. We're honored to be sharing the stage this evening with Winter Words, juxtaposed with the Jessica Cato Leadership Dialogues, and it's a wonderful pleasure to welcome Terry Tempest Williams. Please join me.
How good to see you. Thank you, Tom. It is such a privilege to be here tonight, and I am nervous. I have such respect for your community, the ideas that are grounded here in both public policy and conservation, the legacy of the Maroon Bells, Dottie Fox, and Connie Harvey, and I had the pleasure of meeting Jessica Cato, and I remember her ebullience, her strength of spirit, and it's a great honor to be here with her spirit of leadership. Tom, thank you for the work that you do. We've been talking about heroes, and to me, the real heroes in this country are those who are really doing the groundwork that you are in their own communities. And to all of you who are working on conservation issues in Pitkin County and Garfield County, we are neighbors. And I thank you for the kind of really tough, fierce, beautiful work that you're doing. And we all honor you. I love the Aspen Writers Foundation, and what you don't know is I have held this open space with Lisa for 6 years, and this matters to me tonight because I feel that it's the end of one era and the opening of another. I was to come here in the winter of 2005 for Winter Words. During that time, my brother Steve passed away from lymphoma, and I had to counsel. And I'm here, and thank you. Lisa, you not only are at the helm of a writing organization that is evocative and provocative and local, regional, national, and international, but I think that you show all of us as writers in community not only what is possible but what is necessary. And through these years, whether it's been Ishmael Bea coming by and reporting how much he loves this community, or Bo Fuller, I just want you to know how mindful I am of the leadership that you hold for all of us as writers, particularly in the American West. And I'm reading The Great Gatsby right along with you. And thank you to Natalie Lacey for your insight and care. The programs that are being offered here are so exciting. And Brooke and I were talking today, we're only 4.5 hours away, so I feel like this is a new sojourn for us. As I said, I'm also aware of the Aspen Center of Environmental Studies and the work that Tom's doing. Isa, your mother, she really is here tonight and as part of this dialogue. And Brooke and I have felt deeply, deeply welcomed here in these 2 days. I have to tell you that two other heroes of mine are here. One is Patrick Kelly, who works for the Aspen Institute. We worked together very intimately on a book called The Open Space of Democracy during the Bush era, and if it wasn't for his calm, graceful presence, I'm sure I would have been arrested every day. And he just kept saying, "Breathe, Terry, breathe." And my father, when he accompanied us and Brooke at the Florida Gulf Coast University, where I had been banned and Dick Cheney had been invited the next week, it was Patrick that just kept saying, "Breathe, look at the conversation we're having, you know. So I'm so glad that he's here now as part of your community. Eric Hoffner, who is the community organizer and outreach director for Orion Magazine. If it wasn't for him, I feel like those of us, particularly in the West, wouldn't have a voice, because he is the one that is doing the legwork, community to community. And Eric, thank you so much for all the work that you have done to help us get this story out on the Gulf of Mexico and the voices that really haven't been heard. I think the Aspen Institute and Orion Magazine have so much in common. Both are concerned about ideas, both are committed to leadership, and both, I think, are rooted in a fierce sense of place, not only a sense of place, but an ethic of place. And it's a privilege to be able to see these kinds of interweavings of organizations that we see tonight. Lastly, I'm so looking forward to this conversation with Daniel Shaw. And again, I just can hardly believe that we've only met for 2 days and that there is this connection between Brooke and I and Daniel and Isa. And I think it's a tribute to the community here and the outreach that you extend to all of us who come into this valley. I want to read a piece tonight to just as a preamble to our conversation from a very long article, 14,000 words, that appeared in Orion Magazine in the November-December issue. It's a testament to the magazine and to the staff at Orion that they would allow an article that long. I was asked to write a 5,000-word piece. I write short, and I'm convinced now that I don't even know how to write an essay. More and more it feels like prose poems. But what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt, I was deeply committed to telling it straight through the voices that I heard as a witness. And I just sat down and I thought, I'm not going to quit until I finish. And there it was, 14,000 words. And I thought, how am I going to tell my editor? And what she could have said is cut it by 2/3. But instead what she said was, we can accommodate this. And I think that's the commitment of Orion Magazine, which is so rare these days, especially in a word where it's blogs and opinion pieces rather than really thoughtful offerings of people in place, which is what we wanted to convey at Orion. What I learned, quite simply, is to bear witness is not a passive act, but an act of consequence and conscience. As you know, on April 20th, we saw the Macondo blowout, Deepwater Horizon, 11 men killed. We now know that over 5 million barrels of oil were leaked into the Gulf of Mexico, 2 million gallons of dispersants, Corexit, affecting 632 miles of shoreline in the Gulf, affecting 4 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. What we also know is that this is an unfolding story, that lies have been told both by BP and our own government. And I'm really grateful that we have a democracy where the President's Commission on the Gulf oil spill has been so smart and vigilant, with people like Francis Beinecke and O'Reilly and Graham and Fran Ulmer from Alaska. I trust them, and I think they're really going to show us on January 11th some of the deep interstices that were created of neglect on all fronts. We know that there is this thick layer now that rests at the bottom of the Gulf. And we also know of the illnesses that are ongoing with people who live in the Gulf. I want to read to you a short piece of the first person I met. Her name is Margaret Corral. She is a shrimper and a Cajun fisherwoman, with her husband Kevin. She also works for the UN as a spokeswoman, one of the most fierce, brave women I have ever met. And this was a conversation we had in about 105-degree heat. I live in the desert, but I tell you, it was dripping. Kevin is working on his daughter's motor scooter, taking it apart in the middle of the sidewalk. I can't help but stare at the extravagantly colored tattoo on his back, a narrative needled and inked on flesh that depicts Godzilla standing on a shrimping boat, battling other boats, with oil rigs looming in the background. He gets up, catches my eyes on his back, and shakes my hand. It's a hell of a good story if you want to hear about it. Margaret and Kevin Carroll are Cajun shrimpers. They have lived along the bayous in Guyana all their lives. Today they are staying at their daughter's place in New Orleans, adjacent to a large cemetery. It's beyond humid, and the searing heat leaves me drenched. Margaret has agreed to talk to us about the Gulf crisis as both a resident of the region and an activist who serves on the executive board of the Commercial Fishermen of America. It's a good story, she says, smiling at Kevin. She has a flower tattoo on her right breast, showcased by her low-cut black T-shirt. Let's get a couple of chairs and sit out back. Her dark layered hair, shoulder length, accentuates her yellow-brown eyes. Are you cool enough today, she asks, smiling. On May 16, 2010, Margaret Carroll joined aerial artist John Quigley and sent 3 text messages spelled out with human bodies on the beach in Grand Isle, Louisiana, to BP, the federal government, Congress, and other officials, calling for immediate action to address the economic and environmental devastation from the spill. Their message was simple and direct. Never again, paradise lost, and WTF. This last segment is where Margaret picks up with our conversation. Did you see that there's another spill today? A barge hit ground off Port Fourchon, not far from Grand Isle. That's in the Lafourche parish where we're from. Margaret is referring to headlines in the Daily Comet. New oil spill, Sully's Locust Bay Bayou near border of Terrebonne, St. Mary. About 500 gallons of light crude. It's the second spill this week in southern Louisiana, she says. It's endless and ongoing all over the world. I'm on my way tomorrow to a conference in Norway to talk about the state of fisheries and oil spills, part of my job with the UN. Margaret tells me that her father was an oil man. In the 1950s, before she was born, her parents lived inside the British Petroleum compound in Saudi Arabia. I was adopted. My birth mother was Cajun. I'm Cajun. The transaction was completed for the price of $500 and 2 new dresses for my mother. My parents are dead now, but I've lived in the same house in Guyana for 50 years. And your husband, I ask? My husband has shrimped all his life until the local fishing industry collapsed in 2000. Ask him about separating shrimp from a bucket for his grandmother when he was 3 years old. It's in his blood. He was fishing those waters as a kid, loved it, lived for it. We all did. It's how we raised our daughter. You know why he quit in 2000? Because he was feeling violent. Violent toward the government, violent for them not valuing an honest day's work. He just left what he loved and went and worked for oil. At least we were one of the ones who had options. Margaret explains to us how the local shrimping industry has crashed in the bayous since 2000 due to America dumping Asian shrimp into the market. Quote, our shrimp aren't worth anything, certainly not worth all the effort that goes into harvesting them. My husband used to sell a pound of shrimp all cleaned up and put on a bucket of ice for $7. Then, after the Asian shrimp came in all covered with white blight and crowded out our own southern Louisiana shrimp, he'd get paid under $1. They treat our shrimp like trash. It's not just the money, it's our dignity. The ability to work hard is at the heart of Cajun culture. We are one generation removed from those speaking French, although Kevin still speaks the dialect. What you need to understand is that for us Cajun folk, fishing isn't a business, it's a way of life. It's something beautiful. We may be poor, but we never went hungry. As long as you had a chicken neck that you could throw into the water, we were abundantly fed. As long as we had bread, beans, or rice, we were abundantly fed. We had shrimp, crabs, and coon oysters. We had a free food supply. In these parts, you either fish or you work in the oil fields. So if you take away the oil job with a moratorium on deep well drilling and the fishing is gone, we're down to nothing. Margaret's fast-speaking clip slows down, and then you've probably already heard about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, created by all the dumping of pesticides from farming, the nitrates from farms upriver. She pauses. My sense of hope is fading fast, I have to tell you. She looks away, and then her gaze becomes direct. Don't believe 75% of what you're hearing about this blowout down here. Ask the people on the ground. People are not being allowed to talk. My husband has been working on the water for the past 3 months. Most of what is being done to clean up the oil is to make the American people think something is being done. So what's the story that isn't being told, I ask? 2 things. How much oil actually has gone into the sea and the amounts of dispersants used to make it disappear. The workers are getting sick, she says, with contact dermatitis, respiratory infections, nausea, and God knows what else. The BP representatives say it's all food poisoning or dehydration. But if it's just food poisoning or not enough water, why were the workers' clothes confiscated? As we say in these parts, answer me that. I never really got nervous, she says, until I got a call at 9:30 on a Sunday night from the BP claims office telling me to back off, but I'm speaking out. I kid my friends and family and say I'll leave breadcrumbs. The other day, 2 guys from Homeland Security called to take me to lunch. I'm a chef. They tried to talk food with me, to cozy up and all, and one of them told me he was a pastry chef. Margaret shakes her head, but I knew what they was up to. I'm not stupid. They just wanted to let me know I'm being watched. Here's the truth, Margaret says, now emotional. Where are the animals? There's no toodaloos, the little one-armed fiddler crabs. You don't hear birds from Amelia to Alabama. Kevin never saw a fish jump, never heard a bird sing. This is their nesting season, and 1 billion birds are going to be migrating through in the fall. Those babies, they're not going nowhere. We had a very small pot of sperm whales in the Gulf. Nobody's seen them. Guys on the water say they died in the spill and their bodies were hacked up and taken away. You're not going to hear that in the news. BP and our government don't want nobody to see the bodies of dead sea mammals. Dolphins are choking on the surface. Fish are swimming in circles, gasping. It's ugly, I'm telling you. And nobody's talking about it. You're not hearing nothing about it. As far as the media is reporting, everything's being cleaned up and it's not a problem. But you know what? Unless I know where my fish is coming from, I'm eating nothing from here. Margaret and I sit in silence. I'm suddenly aware of the shabbiness of the neighborhood, the cracking paint on the wooden slats, the weariness of ivy in this dripping heat. I'm sorry, she says. I haven't cried in a long time. I've been tough. I've been holding it all together, but it breaks me up. She looks at me with those unwavering yellow eyes. Have you read Evangeline by Longfellow? I can't speak. Read it. Read it again, she says. It's our story as exiles. If I wasn't speaking out about this, I'd be having a nervous breakdown. I'll tell you another thing that nobody's talking about. At night, people sitting outside on their porches see planes coming into the marshes where they live, and these planes are spraying them with a dispersant. That's the truth. But hey, we're Cajuns. Who cares about us? I don't feel like an American anymore, Margaret says. I don't trust our government. I don't trust anybody in power. She leans forward in the heat as the pitch and fervor of the frogs intensifies. We might not be the most educated people school-wise, but we know more about nature than any PhD. We know what's going on.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you and Brooke for coming. And again, I just want to add my thanks to everybody for coming tonight, and to Lisa and for Tom for doing so much for this community. Really, thank you. And had you ever been to the Gulf before?
Never.
What about this story we associate you with the West? And what about this story was different from anything you'd ever encountered in the West, or anywhere for that matter?
I think like all of us, when we heard what had happened, and as we saw the story unfolded, I didn't believe it. I didn't believe anything we were hearing. I felt a deep kinship with those workers. My family has made their living through oil and gas, natural gas, the Tempest Company, 4 generations. And I felt like it's a story, it's not just the story that belongs to those living in the Gulf of Mexico, but it's all of our story. We're all complicit. I also felt that it's a story we know very well as Westerners. You certainly know it in Garfield County. I mean, all you have to do is go to Rifle, and you know the story of oil and gas in the West, or the Uinta Basin in Vernal, or go into Wyoming on the Jonah field. We know it in the Colorado Plateau. If you fly over Wyoming, it's stunning, in the same way it's stunning flying over western Colorado. Port Fourchon, again, one of those cities that's not a city, only it's on water. So I felt that it was a common story. I also knew the birds, because the birds that I've spent my lifetime watching at Great Salt Lake migrate through the Gulf. It was something I had to do to see for myself.
Have you recovered yet? Or will you ever from that experience?
Brooke knows this. there are some things that you wish you hadn't seen, and I wish I hadn't seen what to say. On day 100 we were there, and on the front page of the New York Times, right-hand corner above the fold, the headline was 80% of the oil gone. And as you read it, it said, it's not as bad as we thought, it's being absorbed. You remember the stories coming out from Carol Browner. On that same day, I flew out with Tom Hutchings, a barefoot pilot, in his Cessna. For 4.5 hours, we flew over the Gulf, over the source where the Macondo well blew out. And for 4.5 hours, we flew 800 feet above the water. For as far as we could see, for as long as we could bear it, horizon to horizon, oil. All we could see was oil. Rivers of oil, braided rivers of oil as wide as the Mississippi itself. The ocean looked drugged. When I asked Tom what was the image that stays with him, he said that during those days when they were burning the oil, he remembers flying and seeing a pod of dolphins, maybe 20, shoulder, 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 side by side, just staring at the flames. Those are the images, those are the lies, the oil, the magnitude, the scale that I can't get out of my mind.
This story probably didn't do much to enhance your view of government, which, starting in Refuge, obviously with the nuclear testing that you witnessed as an infant, and going through just read about regulating wilderness, and now this in the Gulf. But if we can't depend on government to navigate and manage the relationship that we have with our environment, how is that going to happen? How do you think? Who can do that? What can we do to manage that in a way that works for us and for everything else on this earth?
I mean, this may sound silly, but I don't feel cynical. You know, I still love democracy, and I do believe in, I think, really? You believe in the Supreme Court after Gore versus, Bush versus Gore? But I do. I still believe that if enough people rise up, and I still believe in commissions, and I still believe in Congress with people like Michael Bennett and the Udalls, and I still believe in us, that we can make a difference and that we can be outraged. And I guess that was the question, where is our love, where is our outrage? And it's a paradox, because on one hand, I don't believe our government, and I don't choose to work inside it. I appreciate those who do. But the other side is, without government, we wouldn't have public lands. We wouldn't have wilderness. We certainly wouldn't have wilderness in Utah. And nuclear testing might still be going on in the desert. But it was because of our government that it was stopped. And the government stopped because of the people who protested. So I believe in we the people. And I guess what concerns me is what happens if we choose not to engage because it becomes too painful, or because it takes too long, or because we become discouraged. And that's why I think the people that I talked to in the Gulf were so inspiring.
That's it. It is painful. At times, democracy is messy, and when you write at the beginning of Red, it is a simple equation: place plus people equals politics. And how are we to find our way toward conversation? And we were talking earlier today, and you think largely through literature and art. And is that your voice has moved people, and at times moved policy. And have you ever consciously tried to move policy as opposed to moving people?
It's a really good question. And as a writer, I don't see that I've moved people. I see that I've irritated people, especially the people in my family. And, I just keep thinking, really? Come to our family dinner parties, where everyone's packing Glocks, and which at a recent family funeral they were. My father, not too long ago, said, "Terry, I'm so glad you have a hobby." And I thought, a hobby? You know. So I think it's the attempt. And, you know, we're all victim of our obsessions. And I love these open lands. And I love the open space of democracy. And I love how beauty isn't optional, but a strategy for survival. And to me, those are the things that move me in the process of belonging to a community, whether it's in Castle Valley, Utah, or the interior West. It's in community that I really stake my claim.
And you believe in the power of words, though.
I do believe in the power of words, and I don't believe in the power of words. Again, it's this paradox. You know, your question, you know, have I ever tried to move, you know, or affect public policy? It's not politically correct in many circles of writers to say that you are political. I am political, and I do have a point of view. I think the challenge is not to become a polemic, which I have, but I have written op-eds for the New York Times, and they have been about oil and gas and Utah wilderness, be it for the LA Times or in New York, or the Washington Post. I think that matters. I think it matters because that's where the power structures and sources are, and hopefully that gets read. But I think what really matters is the work we do within our own communities, and that's over time. And I think it's about moving our neighbors, and I think that ultimately comes down to breaking bread together.
And having that conversation that seems to be so elusive. And you've had some experiences on the road in the West where you've definitely not been welcome and have turned people around. Could you?
I wouldn't say I've turned them around, but I'd
or
say
you've helped, or
we've
you've facilitated
engaged.
and engaged. And I'm looking around here tonight. It's wonderful to see everybody and so many friends, but there is that preaching to the choir element that goes on here and everywhere. And how do we get people who you would never expect to see in this room? How do we do that?
Come to Utah. You know, I just
Okay,
have to say,
we're road trip. Everybody, we have buses out front.
I have to say, I learned so much from Brooke. You know, and Brooke is the great-great-grandson of Brigham Young, which isn't a big deal because he had 23 wives. You know, but no, I'm sorry. My family was more of heretics, but I watched Brooke in a county commission meeting in San Juan County, which, believe me, if you want to see democracy, go to one of their meetings, and they pray every Monday for their meeting. Forget the Pledge of Allegiance. And I guess there was a dearth of usual prayer givers. And Brooke works for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, and he had just started, and they didn't really know who he was. And the head of the commission said, "Is there anyone here that would be willing to pray?" And there was a long pause, and Brooke stood up and said, "I would be happy to." And so he channeled his inner Brigham Young and gave a very beautiful prayer about creation and, you know, everything. And afterwards there was a long silence, and he said, "And what is your name and who do you represent?" And Brooke said, "Brooke Williams from SUA." And I mean, I thought that they were going to like pass out, you know. But I think that's how, you know, change occurs, and it's neighbor to neighbor going to those meetings. You were talking about, I think, do you mind me telling the story about Wyoming?
No, I'd love for you to tell that story.
You know, we've lived in Utah all of our life, and I didn't realize how community-oriented Utah is. I mean, the legislature is largely Mormon. Salt Lake City is not. But certainly in rural Utah, it is. And you feel that continuum. I feel it in our own families. Wyoming is very different. It's much more of a libertarian view, wide open spaces, ranches. People don't gather in the same kinds of ways. I was teaching at the University of Wyoming as writer-in-residence. The students that I was working with in their MFA program were saying that they wanted to do something beyond the page in the creative nonfiction class. And what we determined was Wyoming is completely dependent on oil and gas, coal, and coal bed methane. If Wyoming was a nation, it would be third in terms of coal production. And so we identified 8 communities around the state that were engaged in oil and gas development. And we made linkages with librarians or people in the humanities or artists where we felt it was a neutral ground. And what we did is we created community gatherings. We called them weather reports. What's the weather in Gillette, Wyoming? What's the weather like in Pinedale? And a student gave a reading, I gave a small reading, and we invited the community to sit in a circle and each talk about what keeps them up at night. What do they see in their community that concerns them, that they care about, that they care for? We thought 7 o'clock till 8:30. Our first weather report in Pinedale, 12:30. Nobody wanted to leave. There were over 100 people, all generations, talking about why is our well contaminated with benzene? You know, what's really going on with Encana? What's happening in the Jonah fields? What about worker compensation? And it became highly, highly political. And people were really, really emotional. And then the next day we had a workshop on storytelling. And the stories that were coming out of the community were breathtaking. And then there was a community reading. It built. In Gillette, Wyoming, there were nurses saying, why is cancer so high in Campbell County? There's so much cancer, the nurses were saying, we can't supply enough chemotherapy. A mother was saying, does anyone have red water in on their ranches? And what about split estate? Do you have a rig right outside your front door, and what are we going to do about it? These were people that weren't able to gather before. And the students, it was such an incredible education, and we were just listening, again, in this circle, what keeps you up at night? It was building. Finally in Casper, which is really the power seat of the oil and gas industry, 2 men walked in and everything shifted. And the editor of the Casper Star-Tribune just said, I hope you've got a spine tonight. And I turned around and I saw a very big man with very big belt buckles. And I said, should I be concerned? And she said, have a good time. And we did what we had always done. A student gave a reading, I gave a short reading, and then we opened it up to the community. There were about 80 people there. When we got to, this was a state senator and what the editor called a local henchman from the oil and gas industry, coal bed methane. When the microphone came to him, he might as well have had a shotgun pointed directly at me. And I have never heard such vitriol and anger and hatred ever. And it was all you could do to just keep breathing. But there was a container that had been created with the community. And because of the community, I was protected, and the students were protected, and we just listened with the same kind of respect that everyone had listened to one another. And the pressure started to build because he knew he only had so much time and he had to pass the microphone to the next person. And after he had said all of these very he broke down and said, I guess what I'm trying to say is this is deep inside me because as a child I grew up as white trash in Casper, Wyoming, and nobody ever took me seriously. And here was the state senator who was the mouthpiece for the oil and gas industry, talking as a citizen, as a human being. And then he passed the microphone to a young woman, and she put her hand on his knee and said, Senator, thank you for sharing your story. And then it went around the room. They didn't leave till 1:45, Brooke, isn't that right? And it was a moment where you realize, you know, we're Westerners. We love this landscape. And if we can find that place of story that bypasses rhetoric and pierces the heart, then I think we can begin to hear each other. What happened after that, because word got out, this was filmed. The students were filming this for their archives. The Democratic Party wanted to defeat this state senator. So would I. He was really, really you didn't want him in the legislature. Very influential members of the Democratic Party asked for that tape, and I had it. And they said, if we can show that, he will be defeated like that, because no one should treat another human being that way, and it really shows who's in the pocket of what. If we run that as an ad, he'll be defeated, he's gone. Will you give it to us? I didn't. And we talked, the students and I, and we realized that in that space, a container of trust had been created. And to have given that would have violated that space and turned something that was deeply personal into something political. And it would have violated, I think, the ethic and essence of storytelling. The end of that story is that the state senator invited us to go out to the Jonah Fields. I took a student, Felicia Reeser, who's a rancher's daughter in Teton County. She was a student at Yale. And Ben Roth, who's an artist, a metal worker. We went out. We were able to get a grant called Invoking the Pause. And for 2 weeks, we traveled all over the state looking at oil and gas, talking to ranchers, talking to coal workers, talking to the workers on the rig. It really changed all of us. And we needed, we had been asked to do an art project that would convey what's happening in Wyoming. What we realized is that there were witnesses to all of this, and they were the pronghorn. And we ended up creating a council of pronghorn with 23 pronghorn skulls floating above fence posts on bases of detritus from the rigs. And if you stand in the center of those council of pronghorns, you feel that space of witnessing. And it turns out that the Council of Pronghorns is traveling around the state of Wyoming, and it's going to end up at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And I really credit the state senator for getting us to really look at the rigs, not just talk about them from afar, but to experience it, and then from our point of view as artists to be able to transform it into another kind of language.
And speaking of another kind of language, your work is really imbued with a spirituality from throughout so much of what you've written. And is that a conscious decision on your part when you sit down to write, or is that just what comes out because of this? Is that the genesis of the connection you have to this land, or is it something that you hope for other people to experience? Is that spirituality that comes through so clearly in your writing?
I think about Meredith Ogilvy in the book that you did with Corinne. When I look at the portraits that you did and the stories that were told, how can you talk to Stuart Udall, bless him, without feeling his deep connection to the land? And I think about Stuart a lot, and I think about Stegner, and although they wouldn't maybe call it spirituality, I think it is that sense of the sacred, of something larger than ourselves, that I think is at the heart of what it means to be a Westerner. That we love these lands, that it's a place of deep, deep humility. You can't take yourself very serious when you're standing in the middle of a blizzard. I think that if we allow ourselves to go deep into the heart of a story, ultimately, when you turn that story inside out, it's a medicine bundle, and that stories take care of us, and that they're the umbilical cord between past, present, and future. Story becomes the conscience of the community. And as a writer, I want to create a sense of stillness in my work, even if it's rooted in anger, even if it's sacred rage, even if it's of the most painful order. How do we as human beings not avert our gaze? And I think it's in that capacity to be present in the moment in hand that we find our transformative power as a human being.
And when do you think you truly found your voice?
I don't think I ever have. I think it's always an attempt. I was talking to our son Louis, who is from Rwanda, and we actually were talking about voice because he's writing his memoir as a genocide survivor. He's 28, and I said, Louis, what do you think voice is? And I thought it was really interesting. He said, I think voice is found, what did he say? I think one's voice follows one's drive to know. And I love that. That the drive to know what's going on in the Gulf, that if you follow that drive, which I would call passion, the voice will follow.
Do you think there's a curiosity in this country has diminished with the change in media and the immediate availability of so much information at any given moment? Do you think that has diminished people's desire to seek and their curiosity?
I don't. I mean, if I look at Louis or my nieces, they're more curious because they want to know what their friends have posted on Facebook, you know? I think what has been diminished is direct experience and direct contact. And that, I think, is serious. And there's a woman in San Francisco who's done an incredible project called The Extinction of Experience. And it's a whole plan for a museum on that. You know, what is Agua de Jamaica? You know, I was just reading The Hummingbird's Daughter by Luis Uria. You know, boiling hibiscus flowers, sifting the flowers and drinking the water. You know, that's direct experience. We just got back from Mexico and we had that drink. You know, to me, that's what I'm hungry for.
And going back, how did you end up in Rwanda?
I think it goes to the heart of what you and I were talking about, that I think all deep, deep change is predicated on relationships. And that's why I think relationships that are based in community are so profound. And I think that's where the real change occurs. It's also where the real difficulty lies. My brother had just passed away, and it was 2005. Lily Ye, who's an extraordinary community artist, Chinese-American, who started the Village of Arts and Humanities in Philadelphia, some of the toughest neighborhoods. She was at a conference in Barcelona. I'll make this quick. She heard Jean Bosco, a representative of the Red Cross in Rwanda, tell the story. 1994, 1 million Tutsis murdered by hand by Hutu extremists. She went up and said 3 words, "How can I help?" And he said, "Come to Rwanda and you'll know what to do." She went to Rwanda. She met with a village of genocide survivors, largely women, mothers. She said, "Tell me your stories." And what she heard is that these mothers were still carrying the bones of their children in swaths of fabric hidden under their beds or outside their homes, their houses. And they said, "Help us build a memorial where our children and loved ones can have a proper burial." And Lily and the women did a perfunctory sketch. She said, "I'll come back with a team." She came back. She asked 4 people to join her as part of Barefoot Artists, and she asked if I would be her scribe. I said no. I didn't want to go to a country so familiar with death. I was broken. Our family was broken. But she never took her eyes off of me. And I think on some fundamental level, I knew that if I had said no, I was saying no to my own spiritual development. I said yes, and I can tell you it made all the difference. And I could never have imagined that I would be making a mosaic with Hutus, Tutsis, Rwandans, Americans, even Louis Gakumba, our translator, who is now our son.
And this is a remarkable book, Finding Beauty in a Broken World, and for you to be able to move from the fate of prairie dogs to the Rwandan genocide and do it in a way that makes sense and that's lyrical and magical, really just...
There would be those that would argue it doesn't make sense. And I can give you so much evidence on that. I gave, again, the great grounding of my father. I said, "Dad, would you mind reading this?" He read it, he called me up and he said, "Terry, the book is such a downer, no one's going to read it." And he said, the prairie dog section is so boring that if they do continue, the rest is such a heartbreak, they'll be sorry they did. And I'm going to tell you a true story because I know there's some writers here, and young writers. It's never easy, and you never get it right, and it's always an experiment. And the only writing I'm interested in is the writing where I'm right on the edge, falling off. And I love Helena Sixu when she says the only book worth writing is the book that threatens to kill you. And this book almost did. I sent this book to Peter Matheson, who is a writer I admire greatly and I've known for 25 years. I've never dared ask Peter for a comment, ever. I never felt I had a book worthy of his comment. I felt that because of his ties to Africa, because of his ties to Native people, because of his ties to endangered species, that this would be a book that he could support. I sent it to him. He wrote me back a very long letter and said, Terry, in all good conscience, I cannot support this book. And he said, you cannot write about prairie dogs and genocide between the same covers. That was devastating. And I wrote him back and I said, Peter, thank you, but I disagree, respectfully. Because I think that the decimation of a species and the decimation of a people is predicated on the same instincts, which is arrogance, ignorance, cruelty, and injustice, and ultimately prejudice. And if we can't make that connection on behalf of life, regardless of species, then I think we're going to continue to propagate this seedbed of war. And that was the attempt in this book. And I ultimately, I think as writers we have to make those risks if we're going to move forward as a species.
Well, I just want to read, if that's okay, 2 paragraphs from this book. First, genocide is not just about the killing of people, but the taking of land. Killing those who have it, claiming it for yourself. Land ownership was one of the incentives those in power gave to those who did their dirty work for them. Erosion, the other genocide in Rwanda, the one rarely mentioned. Rwanda is a country that is literally slipping away. Land, the taking of prairie dogs for the taking of land. The toxicity in the land from pesticides, from radiation that enters our bodies. Steve's death, Mother's death, the millions of deaths around the world from environmentally caused cancers. We're suffering from habitat fragmentation resulting in the breakdown of overall health. So I think that connects everything very nicely in 2 paragraphs. And where do you see hope in this world? Where do you really see it, and where have you experienced it, and what would put you out of business?
That was the other thing. I just have to tell you, I need to go to therapy, obviously. My father just told me, he said, Terry, I just have to tell you, if I was a person and saw you coming toward me, I'd go, oh my God, it's the Grim Reaper. I mean, it's like, thank you so much, Dad, Anyway, I find hope in our families. I think they keep us humble, I think they keep us grounded, and I think they keep us talking. I find hope in students. It's why what I care most about now is teaching. I had great mentors, like Marty Murray, who at 18 told me, I'm going to be gone, you're going to still be here. Please, please speak out on behalf of the Arctic. And now to be able to say after 30 years of hitchhiking, to Denver, Colorado in 1977 on behalf of the Alaska Lands Act, to be able to say to a young activist like Mary Lynn Lindell, a student in Montana, I'm going to be gone, but you're going to be here. Please keep fighting for the Arctic. It's a generational stance. I love that. The resiliency of the human spirit. I look at Louis, who has a signature of a machete on his left hand, who is writing. And he said, I don't care if this book ever gets published. I'm writing this for my brothers and sisters. And who's graduating in international relations and wants to work for the United Nations, the same United Nation that abandoned him. I find great faith and hope in that. And I find tremendous hope in art. that a student from Yale who was on her way to Wall Street, who had been courted by the financial community, after going out to the Jonah fields, after seeing the trucks and the trains 24 hours carrying coal out of her state as a rancher's daughter, said no to Wall Street and said yes to the University of Wyoming, and who wants to become a public lands attorney. I find tremendous hope in that. And I think it's in us to be human. You know, we don't know what the outcome's going to be, but we know how to be present. And whether it's in Pitkin County or Grand County, Utah, you know, I love, love, love our beloved American West.
And I know you wanted to read another passage as well.
Thank you. I love that we just met, you know?
I know. So
and
do
I love that they have the most beautiful guest cabin, don't you? But we're going to come back. This is just toward the end of Finding Beauty in a Broken World. Finding beauty in a broken world is creating beauty in the world we find. Mosaics are created by hand. Louis Gakumba took my hand, and he is now our son. Shards of glass can cut and wound or magnify a vision. Mosaic celebrates brokenness and the beauty of being brought together. Our survival, the vitality of the planet, depends on mental flexibility and emotional acuity. Hands raised, hands put to work, we can improvise. We can create without a map, and we don't have to live in isolation. The gift of an attentive life is the ability to recognize patterns and find our way toward a unity built on empathy. Empathy becomes the path that leads us from the margins to the center of concern. The pattern is the thing. The beauty made belongs to everyone. We all bow. Finding beauty in a broken world becomes more than the art of assemblage. It is the work of daring contemplation that inspires action. Thank you.
Take some questions now. And who has the microphone? Lisa? Oh,
Could
Jamie?
Could we turn up the lights?
Oh, there's a microphone.
So that
yeah, we can't really see. Sure. It's going to be tough. Okay. Laura?
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to know, as a journalist when you were in the Gulf and elsewhere, how you collect your stories, because the stories in your Orion piece are so evocative and true and emotional, and how you draw that out of people.
I really am interested. You know, I really want to know what they're thinking. And so I think the main thing is I just try and listen and get out of the way. I also think it's built on relationships. I mean, every person that I interviewed in the Gulf that's in this story, we are now in contact, and I consider them friends. I'm not objective. You know, I'm the world's worst journalist. But I think you meet each other as human beings, and I take notes. You know, my hand is always in motion. I think it's a disease. I don't use a tape recorder. I tried a tape recorder once, and I stopped listening. And so I see it, I hear it, and I take copious notes. I think I was in the Gulf, I was only there 10 days physically, and I think I came home with 4 journals. So I'm on high speed, you know, just completely there. And then I was under house arrest for 3 weeks, you know, and just, Brooke has to send people in to make sure that I've, you know, gone outside or eaten. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's total immersion. And And then once home, doing lots and lots of research so that you have facts to base the impressions and the narrative of the people. So it's, I think, the experience, the people who live there, and then the facts, and then going back and seeing where the real story lies. And to me, that's the artistry. That's where it turns into literature.
What made you so interested in taking on the challenge to write all of your books?
It's such a good question. What is the challenge of taking on these books? We were at the Explorer bookstore last night, and there was this wonderful broadside by Molly Gloss that said, to write is to be insane. And I thought, yes, that's it. I think it's an obsession for me. It's always the question. A book I wrote called Refuge about the rise of Great Salt Lake and the death of my mother from cancer. The question that kept me up at night was, how do we find refuge in change? With Leap, which is a real descent into madness, where I watched the painting for 7 years, Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights. I was raised under the panel of heaven and hell, never knowing that the garden existed. The body of the triptych, my body. We go on a trip to the Prado Museum in Spain. Suddenly I see this beautiful Garden of Eden with all of these sensual delights. And I think, why was this body of the triptych, my body, held from me? So I think it was that question, what do I believe? And I literally wrote myself out of my own conditioning. After September 11th, when nothing made sense and we saw this narrow definition of democracy, the question that kept me up at night is, how do we find beauty in a broken world? So it's the question that will not allow me to sleep. It's that obsession. And I think the obsession that's holding me now is, and I will tell you this, it's so raw, but my mother has been gone now for 24 years. That's a long time. How old are you? So it's longer than your life. Just now have I been able to retrieve what I had buried so deep in the soles of my feet. About a week before my mother died, she said, Terry, I'm leaving you my journals. I didn't know my mother kept journals. And she said, but you must promise me one thing, that you will not look at them until after I'm gone. And I gave her my word. After she had passed, maybe a month, my father was out of the house, my brothers were, I was there cleaning, and I thought, now. And I went to the place where my mother told me they were, and there they were, 3 shelves of journals, each journal completely unique in a cloth binding, not leather, but fabric. I opened the first journal. It was empty. I opened the second journal. It was empty. As was the third and the fourth. All my mother's journals were empty. I don't know what to make of that. So I'm thinking about voice. What constitutes a voice? How do we find it? How do we use it? How do we keep it? What was my mother saying to me? Was she saying, fill them? Find your voice? Or the one thing I've done religiously as a Mormon woman who has since left the church is keep a journal. It's what we're told since birth. My mother didn't keep a journal. Was that her act of defiance? I don't know. I'll never know. But that's what's keeping me up at night now.
Our community just lost Karen Chamberlain this fall, and I've seen your words on her book, and I'm just curious about your relationship with Karen. And Karen was instrumental in starting the Aspen Writers Foundation, I believe.
I did not know. Sorry. When? In September? Wow. Oh, I'm so sorry. I knew she had cancer. I didn't know.
I'm sorry. I was in Moab. She died this fall. I don't know what days.
I can't believe we didn't hear that.
Yeah, I almost sent the obituary to the paper in Moab. I thought the word would be out. I'm really sorry.
Karen was such a beautiful soul and did so much work at the Horse Thief Ranch. I loved her book. She was such a poet, and she was brave and fierce and generous. Thank you.
If I may change that subject just a little bit. I hope that many of us here, and I suspect that many of us here, try daily to reconcile what you have represented as, the deep passion and love, not just for the West, but for land and for the natural places, with our human exploitation of the places, the minerals, and the resources. And I'm just curious, how do you reconcile our dependence on extraction for our lives and lifestyles?
I mean, that's one of the things that haunts me. We're all complicit, and our options aren't given to us. And I had a really interesting conversation about that notion of complicity, because on one hand, we are all complicit. We flew here, we drive, all of these things that as humans in an oil-based society, fossil fuel society, I think we really need to fight for alternatives. And I think we also have to really make some really tough personal choices. And Brooke and I are in the process of trying to do that, and I don't know what the answer is. I know what the struggle is. I really appreciate leadership like Tim DeChristopher, who's the young man who bid up the oil and gas leases in Utah, and whose trial is now pending in February. I loved him. And, I think we may find ourselves in some really difficult times where I think we have to lay our bodies down. And, this is a part of me that I don't talk about publicly much. But, not too long ago, it was, I guess, in 2009, Brooke and I made the choice of being at the Capitol Action in Washington, D.C., where thousands of people were there to protest and march and walk and shut down the coal plant that fuels Congress, Wendell Berry among them. I loved when a reporter asked Wendell, are you going to be arrested today? And he said, I hope not, but I'm willing to be. And I think those are the kinds of actions that we have to think about. What is civil disobedience in the 21st century? And what are our personal choices, and what will our sacrifices be? I'm haunted by the fact that these blackbirds have just been falling out of the sky. Why? You can't make this up. And, these are the narratives that we're facing right now. It's too easy to say it's apocalyptic. It's too easy to say the world's going to hell. I think it's how do we respond? How do we not become numb? How do we stay awake? And how do we take responsibility? And I don't know the answers. Like I said, I'm living in the struggle. And as I was saying to Stuart the other day, or yesterday at the Aspen Times, I think I'm aware in those mornings when I can't get up out of bed, and believe me, there are many. In those moments, I'm aware of the lack of and limitations of my own imagination. I don't know what to do. And in those moments when imaginations are shared, I think we find collaboration. And it's in collaboration we can create community, and community, anything's possible. So I just keep holding that mirror of community, that sense of engagement, that sense of presence that allows us to stand upright with more courage than we have to stand alone.
if the situation in the Gulf is so much more horrible than people know, it's just stories not getting out. Two questions. Why can't it get out? And what is, based on your research, the real prognosis for that biosphere?
You know, the answer I would have is I don't know, and I don't know. But what gives me faith, two things. One, that collaboration is happening among major national organizations like the Ottoman Society and Environmental Defense, that they are working with local, federal, regional organizations and really looking at an entire restructuring of the Mississippi River-based, system and the Mississippi Delta in particular. That it's not just about Katrina or an oil spill, but it's really about the health of the whole system. And I think that's what we have to look at. It's an environmental Marshall Plan, and I have tremendous faith and confidence in that. But it's long-term, and it's going to take all of our will. And I look at locally, and I think those of us in the West, in communities like Moab and Aspen and Jackson Hole, can think about this model. And that's the Gulf Restoration Network, where one organization is now the umbrella for 46 organizations that are all saying, we're concerned about the health of the Gulf, and this is how we can do it together, and pooling their resources. And I think that is a tremendous model for what we can do in the West, whether it's about our physical health, whether it's about the health of our public lands or the health of our communities. Again, I think we now are in a position where we're really restructuring all of our institutions, how we have known the world. The answers that have worked for us in the past are no longer going to work for us because we're in a situation we've never been before. And that's where I think acts of the imagination are what are being called for. And that's why I think the artist's role, the writer's role, the photographer's role, and each of our roles within our communities, with the gifts we have, each in our own time, each in our own way, each in our own place, like Karen, is where social change dwells, because it's rooted in a love of place. Thank you.
Very quickly, one of the most beautiful voices in the world, and someone who takes herself beyond the brink, over the edge, so that she can convey a message to us. And I hope, on behalf of everyone in our community and everyone here at the Writers Foundation and ACES, think about what you do. Don't let your cars idle. Don't use the plastic bags. Don't use the bottled water. Think about every single step that you make. And I'm a literary person. I'm not the politician, but Terry, you've inspired all of us. Daniel, thank you for being here on stage with her. I also look at what your community is doing. Where's Meredith Ogilvy? Where is she? Meredith's got an exhibit at the Red Brick, which was just hung today and yesterday, and the opening is Thursday, so it's tomorrow. And Terry is in it. There's one of the most beautiful photos of Terry in the exhibit, so please make sure and stop by. We will be honoring Karen this summer during our Aspen Summer Words Writing Retreat, dedicating our poetry workshop, and there's another poetry workshop that's going on with Valerie Haugen. And I just want to call attention to all these wonderful things, all these incredible voices. They have dedicated their lives. Thank you. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Daniel, and I hope that you really will come and join us again. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. See you soon.